So I want to do what we did for the political episode, the uh, Tammy Annie. I'm already forgetting how to pronounce it. Hall episode. But I want to stop the main story for a little bit and take you sideways into the country that this happened in. Because whenever I kind of tell people about the Jonestown story, a huge question I feel like I get somewhere along the way is why Guyana? Why did a country let an American drug addict bring almost 1,000 people into their jungle? Maybe that's my question. Why didn't anybody stop it? And what did the people who actually lived there think was going on? So, in this segment, I want to answer those questions. I want to talk about the prime minister who said yes, and the border he was using Jim Jones to defend, and talk about the locals at the market who thought People's Temple was cute and helpful and brought their radios from them, and talk about the Amerindian families whose children got adopted by white American strangers and ended up in a mass grave in Oakland, California, and talk about the other American fugitive who Burnham gave asylum to for 2 years before Jim Jones. And I want to talk about what the Guyanese people actually said when they finally had a chance to talk about all of this 40 years later. So this is the Guyana of it all. Let's go. First, what was Guyana in 1974? Guyana had been independent for 8 years. It was a former British colony, which matters for one specific reason that I'm going to come back to in a minute, but that it was a former British colony in South America where the population spoke English. And I think that's important because the entire reason Jim Jones picked it over Brazil, over Chile, over anywhere else in the hemisphere is that he needed a country where his Black American congregation could get off of a boat and read the street sign. And this country was ran by a man named Forbes Burnham. Burnham was the Prime Minister of Guyana from December 1964 to October 1980, and then president from 1980 until his death in 1985. Now, here's what you need to know about Forbes. He was not a democratically elected a leader in the way that we use that phrase. See, his party had won the 1964 election with a minority of the vote, and he proceeded to oversee several rigged elections. And in the 1973 general election, Burnham received 70% of the vote and 37 of the 53 seats in the National Assembly. And it's generally accepted that Burnham had a significant untoward influence on the results, basically making them fraudulent. AKA, he cheated. And he cheated in the open, and he cheated with the army moving the ballot boxes, and the international observers, they said so out loud. Now, I think this matters for Jim Jones because in 1970, Burnham did something very specific with this country. He declared it a cooperative republic. He proclaimed Guyana as a cooperative republic in 1970 and took an increasingly socialist stance, and he reestablished diplomatic relations with Cuba and the Soviet Union. And between 1971 and 1976, they carried out a nationalization program, reducing the private sector share of the economy to 10% by seizing American and Canadian owned mines and British sugar plantations and refineries. So imagine what that means for an American socialist preacher shopping for a country. In 1974, Jim Jones is sitting in San Francisco, paranoid, drugged, certain the FBI is coming for him, and he's looking at a map of the world. And what he is looking for is a country that's English speaking, racially diverse, and anti American enough to take him in, and broke enough to want his money. And there is exactly one country at this time that fits all of those four boxes, and it is Guyana. So obviously, Jim needed Guyana. We get that part. He was running. But Guyana didn't have to say yes, so let's talk about why did they. And there are four reasons, and we're going to talk about them one at a time because all four of them matter, and all four of them are the reason that, maybe we're not going to be getting explained to in our American history class, because I don't really think American history probably cares about the inside of Forbes Burnham's head in 1974. But reason one, the money. Jones basically reached an agreement to guarantee that Guyana would permit Temple's members mass migration. And to do so, he stated that they are skilled and progressive, and he showed off a little envelope that he claimed contained $500,000 and stated that he would invest most of the group's assets in Guyana. $5,000, $500,000 in a manila envelope on a desk in 1974 money, which translated would be $3.5 million today. And he's sitting across from the prime minister of a country whose economy is collapsing under nationalization, and he is flashing it. This is a bribe, and it is not technically a bribe because the money was going into the agricultural project, but seriously, like, let's be for real, that's a bribe. Reason two, the border. And this is a part that I feel like doesn't get heard about a lot. But I think this is like really the actual answer to the question of why Guyana said yes. So Guyana has a border dispute with Venezuela. It has had this border dispute since the country was a British colony. Venezuela claims that roughly 2/3 of Guyana actually belongs to Venezuela. And this is actually still true in 2026. The dispute has never been resolved. And in the early 1970s, this dispute, it was something hot. And in the early 1970s, there were intermittent military maneuvers by Venezuela along the border of Guyana. And so the PNC administration of Forbes Burnham moved quietly to strategically strengthen the western border. And apparently, the PNC regime had been thinking of using the Western Essequibo, which is the Northwest District, as this buffer zone to halt any type of military aggression from Venezuela. So a buffer zone, that is really what Burnham gave him. Because, like, let me tell you something about this. Burnham did not give Jim Jones land in the good part of Guyana. He did not give him land anywhere near Georgetown or near the coast where the population lived. He gave them land in the disputed border region with Venezuela on purpose. Because there's also another consideration that influenced Burnham's offer of acreage in the Northwest District, and that was its proximity to Venezuela, because the boundary between the two countries had been in dispute for decades. But it is a dispute which tracks no international attention, and Burnham knew that he would strengthen his own claim to the region if he put Americans there. Because if Venezuela was ever to try something, you know what I'm saying? Like, they would not only be answering to Georgetown, but they also have to answer to Washington. So Burnham gave Jim Jones 1,000 acres of jungle on the Venezuelan border as a human shield. Because if Venezuela ever tried to get it popping and started to roll some tanks across the border, they would not just be shooting at Guyanese citizens, they would be shooting at almost 1,000 American citizens. And like I said, America would have to respond. So the people of Jonestown were essentially a geopolitical chess piece, and they didn't even know it. And the third reason, or the fourth reason, but sorry, accidentally, the third, it's all here in the screen, okay. But the next reason is the opposition, Colt, he already had. So a fugitive from the U.S. David Hill, this is wild, he was given asylum in Guyana in 1972, and he fled to Cleveland in 1972, where he was appealing, he fled from Cleveland, where he was appealing conviction of corporate blackmail, and under a new name, which was Rabbi Edward Emmanuel Washington, he established a cult following of hundreds of members under a so-called religious organization he called the House of Israel. So I'm saying that to say this, that Burnham already had one. 2 years before Jim Jones showed up, he'd already taken in a different American fugitive and let him build a different American cult on Guyanese soil. And in 1972, Rabbi David Hill arrived in Guyana and established the House of Israel, a religious sect that had opposition accused of operating as a private army for Burnham's PNC. And in 2014, Joseph Hamilton, he's a former House of Israel priest, he testified that the House of Israel committed oppressive and terrorizing acts on behalf of the PNC. So, like, do you see the pattern here? Forbes Burnham was using American cult leaders as private security forces. So this was already a strategy. This was already a thing he did. So by the time Jim Jones showed up in 1974 with an envelope full of cash, Burnham already had a playbook, and Jim Jones fit it. Next point is the references. And this is where it's going to come all the way back to part 3 about the San Francisco politics. Burnham stated that Guyana allowed the temple to operate in the manner it did on the references of Moscone, Mondale, and Rosalind Carter. And he also said that when Deputy Minister Reed traveled to Washington, D.C. in September 1977, they had to sign the Panama Canal Treaties. Mondale, by this point, who's basically the U.S. vice president, was like, "Hey, what's up? How's Jim?" And this gave Reed the indication that Mondale had a personal interest in Jones' well-being. The Prime Minister of Guyana, after the massacre, when the entire world was asking why this happened, his answer was George Moscone vouched for him. Walter Mondale vouched for him. The lady the First Lady of the United States vouched for him, and he was not lying. And that is what made Jim Jones legible to Forbes Burnham. He didn't even show up as just some random preacher. He showed up as a man whose business card had the vice president's name on the back of it. And the vice president of the United States, sitting in Washington, D.C., was asking the deputy prime minister of Guyana how Jim was doing as casually as you would ask about a mutual friend. Y'all, this is literally how you get a state within a state. Isn't it insane? Okay, so now that we talked about the government, let's talk about the people. What did the regular Guyanese folks think was happening in that jungle? And the answer for most of the time Jonestown existed is honestly not much and not bad. Locals weren't afraid of Jim Jones or People's Temple, and honestly, apparently they had a very positive presence in the community. They sold things like radios in local markets, and they taught local school children in their schools. And like it's interesting, right? Jonestown to the people of Port Katuma were not scary or creepy. It was like the white Americans who run the radio store. Like that's who they were. They were neighbors. They came into the town. They brought produce. They sold goods. They taught at the schools. They integrated with the local economy. And the cooperative socialist Guyanese government, they liked the promise of equality offered by Jonestown, and they promoted establishment to provide medical, educational, and agricultural assistance to the rural northwest region of Guyana. And that was the pitch on the Guyanese side. Like they're feeling like, all right, these Americans about to come help us develop the Northwest. And they're going to bring doctors and teachers and tractors. They're going to show our kids how to read. For a region of Guyana that the government had been ignoring for hundreds of years, this was a real offer of help. And the majority indigenous Amerindian population in the inner regions were among the most neglected of Guyana's rural communities. And school buildings were in serious disrepair or had been closed, and the children were forced to forego education or to travel long distances on foot or by canoe, child. Like canoe. Could you imagine, Mom, can you get the canoe so I can get to school? That's dedication for real. And the Amerindian families in that region, the indigenous communities, the people whose ancestors had lived on that land for thousands of years before either the British or the Americans showed up, they were the poorest of the poor in an already very poor country. And the government of Georgetown did not care about them. Their schools were broken, their clinics did not exist, and their children were walking miles through the jungle to get to a classroom with no roof, or trying to get on the canoe, child. Could you imagine if you need to get on one canoe to get connected to another canoe? I'm just gonna not go to school. But one day for them, some white Americans show up with a tractor, a generator, medicine, a school building with desk and a clinic with a real doctor, and they say that they're gonna help you bring your kids. You gotta see where this is going. And maybe you don't see where this is going because there were children at the gate, okay? So this part really kind of haunts me every time I really think about it. But the number of the people that passed, that died, that were killed includes 8 native-born Guyanese, all of them children, with the oldest being 16, all of them adopted or in the process of being adopted. Among the unclaimed, unidentified dead, controversially, were also a number of Amerindian or Caribbean children that the Jones Temple had adopted, and over 400 remained unclaimed or unidentified, and they were buried in a mass grave in Oakland, California. And these should never had ended up in the US, buried far away from their homeland, and their real parents, who mostly out of desperation had left them at the gate and given them for adoption in the hope that they'd get a better life that way. Instead, they were given a nasty death and taken away completely. Like you really like that really just hits me. Like there are indigenous Guyanese children in a mass grave in Oakland, California, because their parents handed them over to a white American preacher at a gate in the jungle because the white American preacher promised that he would feed them, school them, give them a future that the country they were born in could not give them, and he killed them. And then their bodies end up getting flown 4,000 miles north of the country that they were born in and buried in an unmarked dirt in a cemetery that their families have never visited and probably don't even know exists. And this is the part of the Jonestown Full Lake that no one really talks about. And this is the part where the same colonial logic that built Guyana in the first place, the logic where somebody from somewhere else shows up and says, trust me, I'm here to help. Give me your land, your labor, your children. That exact logic played out one more time in 1978 in a clearing in the jungle. And the consequences of that logic was the Carib and the Amerindian babies who died on a Saturday afternoon with the American socialists who had promised them a better world. And you see, despite government attempts to expand education access and the undercurrent of colonial policy, espousing racial and resource consolidation and visualization, and imposed itself upon the cultural and territorial heritage of Amerindian people. And I think I just pronounced like 18 million words wrong, but it just this part just always gets me, and I'm like not even looking at my screen at this point. But because I just like my head like sometimes goes like the 16 year, like the kids who are old enough to like know what's going on, but like there's nothing they could do about it, and like this is not what they expected. You know what I'm saying? Like, Jonestown may have been viewed from an Amerindian culture perspective as a continuation of colonial consolidation. And a scholar from San Diego State University, like, basically said like Jonestown was colonization with a socialist wrapper on it. And see, it's interesting because the indigenous people of that region, they had already seen this movie before, which is why I think that quote is interesting because they had shown up and seen the British show up and say trust us, and they had seen the Dutch show up and say trust us. They had seen the missionaries show up and say trust us. In 1974, when Jim Jones showed up and said trust us, a lot of those families did because what choice did they have? And the price some of them paid for trusting one more time was their children, and 8 of them by name on the manifest. Probably more if you count the ones who were in process. You know, even though I don't know those 8 kids' names, like, I just really think about them. And I like just remember that they existed. I think it's, if you want to, I think you should do. Like, just remember that they were some of the youngest casualties of a 400-year-old pattern, and it didn't start with Jim Jones, and it certainly didn't end with him. Now, let's back up and go back to the country level, if you will. So, after November 18th, 1978, the Guyanese government had to answer for what the hell just happened on their soil. And the answers they gave were like literally all over the place. So Jonestown, Jim Jones settlement, located not far from Port Katuma, was secretly given autonomy by the Guyana government. And it became, according to the Mirror editorial of the 21st November 1978, a state within a state. That is what Guyanese press called Jonestown 3 days after the massacre. That this is not an American observation. This is the Guyanese press I'm talking about in Georgetown, basically saying that we don't control this place. The Americans had their own country inside our country, and we let them have it. And the United States Department, 5 months before the massacre, had already noticed, by the way. In June 1978, a State Department report characterized the autonomy that Jones subsequently found in Guyana this way. During the consular visits, it has been observed that the local Guyanese administration exercises little or no control over the Jonestown community, and that the settlement's autonomy seems virtually total. You see, the State Department knew 5 months before the dying started. They wrote it down in a memo, sent it to Washington, and nobody did anything about it because nobody had jurisdiction. Guyana said, hey, they're Americans, not my problem. America said, hey, they're in Guyana, not our problem. And in the middle of both governments kind of like just shrugging their shoulders, almost 1,000 people died. And now here's the part where the locals kind of got the real story. So many of the locals were happy to describe Jones as the devil's incarnate. And one Guyanese man recalled witnessing a woman throw a grapefruit into the ditch, and Jones' voice could be heard over the loudspeaker, publicly scolding her. Or there was another time a boy was forced to eat chili after wetting the bed. Devil's incarnate, not incarnate. I cannot even say it, incinerate, which is basically incarnate. Yeah, I did say it right. That's basically the local saying like the devil himself in a cage in our jungle. And that is the language they're using 40 years later when somebody comes back and inquires about it. And a lot of the witness on the airstrip shooting and of the Jonestown massacre aftermath, they were very traumatized. A lot of locals avoid the place. There's a lot of wild conspiracy theories, and quite a few locals believe the place to be haunted. And the site of Jonestown today is covered in jungle. You literally cannot find it unless someone who has lived through it takes you there with a machete. The locals won't go. They won't drive past it. They believe the place is haunted, and I'm seriously not going to argue with them. And there's also a piece here about how the Guyanese people themselves feels about who gets to tell the story. A lot of them have expressed frustration that once again, inquiry into Jonestown was not coming from within Guyana, but from somewhere in North America. But there were a few who were finally happy that a Guyanese not affiliated with the government was finally investigating this act, and they felt that they could be a bit more open in expressing their problems. And I think that's a whole problem. Every single documentary, every single book, every single podcast about Jonestown, including the one you're listening to right now, is made by Americans and aimed at Americans and centered on Americans and not the Guyanese people whose country this happened in, still mostly are not the ones telling the story. And you know what? I'm not Guyanese. I'm black. I'm not Guyanese. I'm not anything else. I'm just black. I mean, I guess I'm black and I'm an American podcaster, but I'm still gonna try to do what I can to talk about it all, even though it's still like not really changing much. But let's talk about the wives, the girlfriends, and the ambassador. Really quick, let's talk about how the temple stayed protected politically on the Guyanese side because it was not just the prime minister. One temple member, Paula Adams, became romantically involved with Lawrence Boney Mann. This was Guyana's ambassador to the United States. I don't know how much I'm gonna tell you about this one. Let me see how long I've been talking for this episode. This is just like insane. Like there's always just something else to find out about this man and everything involved with it. But Paula Adams, she basically became involved with the Guyana's ambassador to the United States. And Jones bragged about this to other people's temple members, and he would refer to her as a public relations woman, given all for the cause in Jonestown. And Burnham's wife was also Viola. She was a strong advocate of the temple as well, by the way. But I kind of want to tell you a little bit about the Paula and Bonnie situation because it's like a little insane. So Paula basically, she comes into the picture of People's Temple. She grew up in Ukiah, California. That definitely does matter because that's the place where People's Temple lands after Jim Jones moves the operation out of Indiana. And so she joins the People's Temple and she feels like Jim Jones gave her a job, a purpose, a country to go to. And she married another temple member named Tom Adams. And her dad was also a People's Temple member, though he did not move to Guyana. He was a radio operator in the temple in San Francisco. Or that could have been her husband. I can't remember which one. But she got to Guyana because she was actually one of the first people who got to Guyana. She was basically planted there in a whole bunch of black men, politicians, to be like the white woman to catch their eye. Jim knew what he was doing. And Jim also noted that she was not doing very well at Santa Rosa Junior College. So he wanted her to move on to mission work, aka being a public relations woman. This man is so disgusting. And Paula Adams barely went to Jonestown. She was a member of People's Temple who went to Guyana on one of the first trips in the country in 1974, and she did not return to the U.S. because she didn't live until after the death in November 1978. But during those 4 years, she principally worked in the Temple's headquarters in Georgetown, acting as liaison between the group and the government, Guyanese government. And she rarely ever went to Jonestown. Her whole job for 4 years was the capital city. Lamaya Gardens, where Edith is at in the beginning, that's where she's at. And she's living there with Sharon Amos and Debbie Tuchedi. And together they all ran the temple's PR operation in the country. And she also worked the angles, because it's known that Jones assigned many young, attractive women to seduce the Guyanese officials in order to get inside information on how the local government was actually perceiving the temple. And so Lawrence Boney Mann, he was 13 years Paula's senior and Guyana's ambassador in Washington between 1975 and 1981. And Mann had known Jones when the People's Temple was headquartered in San Francisco, and Jones was working to set up his Guyana outpost. And since that time, the 46-year-old Lawrence Boney Mann, he changed his life too. So first he was a trade guy, and he was known in diplomatic circles, and he was a brilliant trade negotiator. And he was very smart and charming, and he drank and he read the room, and he was kind of diplomat people would invite to dinner because he's fun. And he was already married when he met Paula, actually. He had kids from previous marriages, and Paula was Lawrence's third wife, and he had 3 other children from his previous marriage, so she was his third wife. And he was the kind of man who had already had a track record of not being a very stable husband to anybody. And when they met in Georgetown, they met in Georgetown in 1974, and then he became the ambassador in 1975. And this means that for the first year that they knew each other, he was a Guyanese government insider in Georgetown, and she was the American who basically knew the Guyanese government. And they met exactly the way Jim set it all up. While working in Georgetown, Paula Adams meets Lawrence Mann, and the two quickly become in a relationship. Paula actually tried to hide it from Jim as long as possible. And apparently, they were even getting it on at the residence of Arthur Chung, who was the president of Guyana at the time. That is insane, right? That's not some discreet hotel room situation. That's the inner circle of the country knowing exactly what's going on. And people know he's married, but this is the way they lived. And I don't think it was a secret. I think it was known to everybody in Georgetown. But Here's the wild wrinkle, and whether by assignment or by choice, accounts differ. She became sexually and later romantically involved with Mr. Lawrence Boney Mann, and it was a very tempestuous relationship. And he was married, and he didn't leave his wife to permanently join his mistress for a number of years. And the ambiguity and the uncertainty and the periodic volatility of the affair, it haunted Paula so much that she considered unaliving herself. And she wanted to unalive herself years before what I'm about to say happens. And she was already in pieces of this man before the temple ever fell apart. Because there is something that happens between them. Like their story does have an ending that does not have to do with being at the people's temple. Sorry, I'm off on this side tangent, but I just found out this information. I just think this is insane. But another layer, she was also spying on him as part of her responsibilities. Again, whether assigned or voluntarily is not known. But Paula filed numerous reports of her conversation with Mann, both about their personal relationship and about what he revealed of his interactions with the Guyana government in a professional manner. A lot of these reports, they had the tone and style and content of like a really, really personal diary, even kind of more than Edith's a little bit, rather than a formal record. And she even says this sometimes on numerous occasions. And she was also secretly recording tapes of them talking in bed in their phone calls, and she was sending them back to Jim. And there are mentions that Paula secretly recorded a number of her future husband Lawrence Mann's private telephone conversations with Guyanese officials as well. They even filed transcripts of these conversations that the Guyanese government didn't think anyone else had heard in Jonestown. Isn't that insane? So the real picture of this relationship is a woman who was in love with the man, who was assigned by her cult leader to seduce that man, who was also secretly taping the man and turning the tapes over to her cult leader, and who was also considering unaliving because the man would not leave his wife, who was also bringing the man closer and closer inside of the cult. And she was doing all four of these things were happening at once for 4 years in a country that was not even her country. And on November 18th, 1978, that tragic day, Paula's at the La Maya Gardens, and she survived the Jonestown death because, again, she normally is never at Jonestown anyway. And she actually ends up appearing alongside several other survivors in post-tragedy interviews, and then she made a quiet return to the United States. She came back in 1978 of December with the other Georgetown survivors. And this is the point where Temple's over. Jim's dead. Almost everyone she had known for the last 4 years is gone. Her roommate, Sharon Amos, remember her, Shawanda, had killed her own kids and herself in the same house Paula was in. They heard a scream from upstairs where the other members were. They heard the kids screaming, "No, mommy, no." And when they got upstairs, they found that Sharon Amos had done what she did to her kids and herself. And that's basically what Paula walked out of. That is the room that she was in. And then she gets on a plane to America, basically. And at this time, Boney's still the ambassador. He stayed the ambassador until 1981. So for the first 3 years after the massacre, he's still living in Washington as Guyana's official representative. And she's still in the United States. And they kept going. And so in San Francisco, Richard said that all she could think of when she heard the news was Mann sitting in their office after the Jonestown tragedy. And he was angry with Jones. And he said, feeling he had been deceived and that Paula had been used by Jim Jones. And most of all, he was angered by the death of the children. And she recalled him saying that he could understand Jones' suicide and perhaps even the suicides of his followers, or unaliving. I keep messing up. But he went back to Paula's old temple co-workers. And he ended up telling them, man, that he felt played, that he felt Jim had used her, that he could not understand the killing of the children. And this is Boney's read of the situation months after, but he stayed with Paula. He divorced his wife. He actually told to Richards, the person I just talked about earlier, that their intention was to be married, and that Mann paid for the divorce, basically. And that Mann said that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Paula. And so in 1979 of May, Mann had his final divorce. So now that I've said all that, the timeline's kind of like November 1978 massacre, December 1978, she gets home. May 1979, his divorce is final. Montgomery police said that they moved to Washington area in March 1980, and that December, Paula worked for a computer firm, Libra Technologies in Rockville, according to an associate there. And then for the last year, the police said that she lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Bethesda, where something happens. So she followed him to DC. She got a job at a computer company in Rockville. She got promoted. She had a normal looking life on paper. Miss Paula Adams right here. And after this mass unaliving in Jonestown, Lawrence Mann and Paula Adams got married. Yeah, They got married. The mistress spy survivor and the ambassador. They got married after Jonestown. They had a baby in 1982, Lawrence Alexander Mann, the baby that everybody called Alex. And there was a problem because the baby was sick. And the baby, Paula's life was revolved around the baby. He had a congenital stomach problem that prevents a child from keeping food down. And so he was in the hospital and had an operation. And everyone said Paula handled it well. But her whole life by 1983 was the baby. She had a job, she had an apartment, she had a kid she adored who kept getting sick and bouncing in and out of hospitals. And her and Mr. Mann, Boney, separates. And eventually, Mann ends up joining her wherever she was, and the two of them, they had the kid together. And eventually, though, they became estranged from each other. And then in October 1983, during what Bethesda, Maryland described as a domestic dispute between the two over custody and visitation rights, he shot Paula and their son before turning the gun on himself. A custody fight, a garden variety, every divorce court in America custody fight. He was no longer the ambassador. He had lost the post in 1981. He lost his career, his first family, his country's official patronage, and he was about to lose his son. And Paula's father had heard rumors that Mann could be a violent person after he had been drinking. And so on October 24th, 1983, in Bethesda, it's reported at about 9:30 p.m., a man passing Adam's apartment heard terrible screams and bangs on the walls, followed by 2 gunshots. And after hearing this, the woman asked the woman at the front door to call the police. And when police arrived, they found the bodies just inside the apartment, and both Paula and her son had died from gunshot wounds to the head. And Mann died about 2 hours later at a suburban hospital. Paula and Alex died at the scene. He lived for about 2 more hours, then he died at the hospital. And she's buried in Silver Spring. The baby's with her. I don't know where Boney is buried, but he has his own Find a Grave page. So it's just insane because Paula was a survival in a technical sense and a casualty in every other sense. She walked into the People's Temple at 22 and she described herself as manic, depressive, and self-medicating. And Jim Jones picked her off the floor and gave her a country to live in and a man to seduce. And that man was already married, already drinking, already older, already willing to cheat on his wife at the president's house. So neither of them was healthy when this thing started. And then the temple implodes around them. And the relationship was the one thing they had left from those years. And they tried to make it into a normal marriage in the DC suburbs, and it did not hold. And the thing I keep coming back is the baby. Like Alex, he's 18 months old. He has a stomach defect. He's out of the hospitals his whole life. His mother adores him, and his father was the only person in the world who would have hurt him. And his existence, in some ways, I think the one piece of Paula's life that was not engineered by Jim Jones. Alex was hers. She chose him. She had him after the cult was over, and he was the one who didn't make it out either. So it's insane to me because even just like learning about this side note, like when I look at them, I think the honest answer is when they were 2 lonely, fucked up people who met inside a geopolitical operation. They fell in love anyway, survived the massacre together, and tried to build a regular American life on top of all of that, and just could fucking not. The temple did not let go. It does not let go. Boney told Paula's old co-workers he was angry that Jim used her. And then 5 years later, he did the worst thing Jim ever did, which was hurt a little one. The thing he said he could never forgive Jim for, he did it himself in a Bethesda apartment with his own son. Going back. This is the exact pattern I've been showing you for like 6 episodes now. The temple used women to infiltrate the political class of whatever country they were operating in. In San Francisco, that was Carolyn Layton and Maria Casares in the Moscone campaign. In Georgetown, that was Paula Adams in the bed of the Guyanese ambassadors of the United States. And at the top of the Guyanese government, the own prime minister's wife, Forbes Burnham, was a true believer. And that is how a state within a state survives. You make sure the wife loves you. You make sure the ambassador is sleeping with one of your soldiers. You make sure the vice president of the host country knows your name. And then, for as long as those relationship holds, nobody comes looking. Okay, so one more piece and I'm gonna let you go. On the day of the massacre, with the bodies hitting the ground around Jim Jones, he sent 3 men off the compound with suitcases. The contents of those suitcases tells you exactly what Jonestown was really about geopolitically by the end. Tim Carter, we've talked about him a few times. He was saved by an order from Jim Jones for him and his brother Michael and Jones follower Michael Prokes to flee with 3 suitcases containing $1.6 million in cash and gold. And the men were armed and told to take the money in plastic wrapped $100 bills and 1-ounce gold wafers to the Soviet embassy in Guyana's capital. Okay, I really want you to picture this. It's November 18th, 1978. The cyanide is already in the cup. The children are already dying. And Jim Jones, the supposed socialist who came to Guyana for the utopia, hands 3 of his guys $1.6 million in cash and gold bars and tells them to take it to the Russians, not to a Guyanese bank, not to a Guyanese charity, not to anyone in the country he had been living in for the last 4 years. He wanted to go to the Soviet embassy because by the end, Jim Jones was not loyal to Guyana. He had been shopping for the next country for months. Said he had a plan to move to the Soviet Union, and he went so far as to invite Soviet diplomats from Georgetown to visit and to require Jonestown residents to take classes in the Russian language. And he also spoke periodically of an immigration to an unnamed African nation. So he was going to do this to Guyana and then leave. He was going to use up the Burnham administration's hospitality and then take the survivors. He wanted to leave. Listen, he wanted to leave most of them there, okay? But he was going to take the survivors he wanted to take with him to a whole nother country. Take the money, take the gold to Moscow, and he's going to do it again somewhere else as a Soviet client state cult until Moscow got tired of him too, and then do it somewhere else, probably in Africa for all we know. The man at the top of the pyramid was a parasite on every host he could find, and Guyana wasn't the first host. India was, Indiana, and then California. And then Guyana was a third, then Moscow would have been fourth, and we never found out what the fifth would have been because he ran out of road on a Saturday afternoon in the jungle and took 918 people with him when he ran out. So I want to end tonight with the Guyanese voice, not an American one. His name was Walter Rodney. He was a Guyanese historian, a Pan-Africanist. I thought that I had a picture of him, but I did not put it up. So excuse me while I... Oh, y'all know I normally have like a... It took my screen. I do have a picture. Just not say anything and then I think you pick it up. So Walter Rodney, Pan-Africanist, a Marxist scholar, and one of the most important Black intellectuals of the 20th century, was killed in 1980 by a car bomb in Georgetown that the Burnham government most likely ordered. And he died on June 13th, 1980 in Georgetown at the age of 38 in that car bomb explosion. And his brother Donald, who was also injured in that explosion, said that a sergeant in the Guyana Defense Force and a member of the House of Israel named Gregory Smith had given Rodney the bomb that killed him. The reason I've been talking about some of this stuff, okay? The bomb that killed Guyana's most important historian was given to him by a member of the House of Israel, which is the other American cult that Forbes Burnham had imported and was using as a private enemy. The man who held the bomb was a Guyana Defense Force sergeant. The man who gave the order was almost certainly the prime minister himself. And this is in the country that Jonestown happened in, a country where the prime minister had two American cults on retainer and used one of them as a buffer against Venezuela and used the other as a death squad against his political opponents. And both of them eventually killed people, and neither of them was fully investigated by anybody. In 1979, 1 year after Jonestown, Rodney gave a speech at Stanford about all of this. He did. And I'm going to read it. He said, I'm not reading, I'm going to read the quote. He said, "The establishment of Jonestown was not in the national interest. The people of Guyana would have said that the authoritarian control exercised by the leadership in this settlement over the various individuals was not compatible with the rules governing the behavior of citizens, all citizens in the society. If they were serious about certain ideological pronouncements which they were making, they would, of course, have said that this was not a socialist settlement in the least." Translation: this was never a socialist project. This was an authoritarian project wearing a socialist costume. And any Guyanese person who actually knew what socialism looked like could tell you that. And the Burnham government knew it. And they did not care because Jonestown was useful to them. And you know what? Walter Rodney said that out loud in 1979, and he was dead within a year. So that is the Guyana of it all. If you ever see the front gate of Jonestown as it stands today, it's a jungle. It's covered. There's one rusted post. I'm gonna say rusted post, and one piece of sign, and that's all is left. The locals don't go there. The Guyanese government has floated tourism plans a couple of times, and the plans just keep fizzling it out because what are you gonna charge people to see? A clearing, a cassava mill, a tractor, some ghosts? And the country moved on in the way countries do when something terrible happens in a part of country where most of the country never visited anyway. Most Guyanese people today who are under 50, they know the word Jonestown the way Americans know the word Waco, which is to say vaguely, sadly, and as something that happened before they were old enough to ask questions about it. But the 8 Guyanese children are still in a mass grave in Oakland. The Mara Indian families who gave up their kids to white strangers at a gate are still living in that region, and their grandchildren are still living in that region, and nobody from America has ever probably gone back to their villages and said sorry. And to be honest with you, what would their sorry do, you know? But that's the Guyana of it all. And that is what our country participated in, even if we didn't pull the trigger. Now, next week, we get back to the main story. Next week, we finally go to Indiana. I promise no side quest. Next week, we meet Jem as a boy in a small town, and we understand how a person becomes the man who would end up giving suitcases of cash to the Soviets while children died around him. And I love how I keep saying next week, but I know I'm going to probably record this episode maybe today or tomorrow. But I just wanted you to know about this part first, because I feel like if you walk into Indiana, and I keep saying this next week, thinking Jonestown was just an American story, that we're also the missing part of it. That it's an American story and a Guyanese story and a Amerindian story and a Cold War story and a colonial story all at the same time. And the pyramid we talked about in part 6 was one pyramid, but it's set inside another pyramid, which was the country it was in, which set inside another pyramid, which is the world it was in. And you get what I'm saying? I keep saying the pyramid's just going all the way down. It's gonna climb you down, but again, upside down and like. But I guess next time I'll see you in Indiana.